As ever, when it comes to two-parters, I wasn't really sure if I was going to do a one or a two-part when it came to this episode. I wasn't sure if I would have enough to talk about, but I have an entire page filled with just the first episode, so even though this might end up being just like a 30-minute video or whatever, I think we'll go ahead and separate it. Especially since Part 1 and Part 2 were actually written by different people and directed by different people. So, one of the biggest benefits of doing a two-parter, and I know I've talked about this before, is the fact that you gain a lot of budget cheats, basically, because you can afford things that otherwise you wouldn't be able to because you're getting greater use out of them, basically. And it makes a degree of sense. It's kind of a weird thing to think about, but when you consider, if you're hiring a guest star for 2 episodes is cheaper than hiring a guest star for 1 episode and then hiring another guest star for a second episode, it kind of makes a degree more sense. Just to name one example of what I'm talking about. The same is true for set design and location pieces, that kind of thing. So you can justify more. And dancing the budgetary dance is always something that's basically required when it comes to making a television show. One of those unfortunate realities you have to deal with. I bring all this up, again, because this episode really kind of showcases what I mean by that. There's a lot of obvious money on display, a lot of really good new set design. Some of them are actually repurposed sets, but there's some genuinely new sets. They have several nice panoramas, most of which were actually done in full 3D CGI, which I know nowadays seems normal, but back in the day was actually still fairly new. I remind you, and I'm sure a lot of you actually know this already, if you went back to, say, the TNG or the DS9 era, most of those establishing shots were a matte painting. Later on, they became advanced enough to have a couple of guys milling around in front of a green screen shrunk down to this in front of a matte painting. Having this full 3D presentation of the place was expensive and unique and added some interesting flavor to it. I actually rather liked it. I like the aesthetic of this world in general, actually. It's something that I admit has kind of inspired me in a recent series of literary works I've been working on called The Periphery, because I've gotten this impression, and this is the first thing I want to talk about, I've gotten this impression that these people are tremendously inefficient despite being technologically advanced. In other words, these people can, and do have space travel. They do have FTL, they do have the ability to go throughout the system, and indeed have contacts throughout the sector, because people come here from other systems looking for work. And yet, they have a labor shortage. A overwhelming, critical, skilled labor shortage. Now here's the thing. I'm going to go ahead and spoil something for you right now. They never explain that in either episode. And that admittedly bugs the hell out of me. It's the crystalline entity problem all over again. I'm not going to get too much into it, but too often science fiction, or fiction in general, regardless of the type, will introduce something because it's a neat concept, but never explain how it came to be. And without that backing, without that foundation, my opinion, it's always a weaker thing. It's a weaker concept for that lack of foundation. So why is there a labor shortage? Now, my answer to that is based on what we see on display here. They're working at a power distribution facility, and there are hundreds of people swarming over that place like ants. How many of you like Star Wars? I mean, I do. I like Star Wars. It's good. It's kind of cool. There's a ship in Star Wars called the Dreadnought. And I know I'm a ship guy, but the thing that has always interested me about the Dreadnought is that it was an incredibly powerful ship that was incredibly badly built. The Dreadnought, for its time, was a Dreadnought. It was a doomed ship, a big, powerful battleship. And it could take on most of the other ships of the era, with relative ease, actually. If you just look at the ship, and not what's required to run the ship, it was actually superior to many other ships, and could actually take out a VSD in a one-on-one, under the right circumstances, with a good commander at its head. Thing is, the Dreadnought was a piece of crap from an engineering perspective. It needed thousands upon thousands of crewmen constantly manually running everything. You see where I'm going with this? I think that these people, despite being fairly advanced, despite having decent high-tech, have incredibly inefficient tech. They have not developed along technological lines of moving towards things like automated redundancy or, basically the computer era that we in real life have had, but also that the Federation has had. A lot of the Federation's overall technological advancements have been along computing lines and what they can do with those computers and what that enables them to accomplish thereafter. These people have decent power, decent space travel, decent firepower, and yet have to have 100 people running around constantly manually regulating things. There's even a line, I forget the exact phrasing, where a gentleman basically tells the fake Chakotay, or excuse me, the disguised Chakotay, we run on this incredibly inefficient thing. I forget what he says, but it is something that in real life would be an extremely inefficient method of production. So we need you to constantly regulate it. Imagine for a moment being the kind of person who has to stare at a console and just fiddle with things constantly, and if you screw up for, I don't know, longer than, say, a minute, you might actually cause some serious troubles. One person out of the hundreds. It's no wonder they go out of their way to keep their employees happy. They rely on all of them. That's my theory. Now, I've heard several other theories posited. Maybe there was some kind of disaster, maybe there was some kind of technological boon, all that kind of stuff. In fact, if I could share one of the other theories, I mentioned the technological boon one. One of the other theories I've heard is that within the last generation, so like within the last 20, 30-ish years, some race came along, or races, or group came along, and basically provided the Vulcan moment for these people. Here, technology. If I haven't talked about it before on Voyager, the Vulcan moment, it's something I refer to as like the moment at which an organization, usually a species, basically wakes up and has this epiphany and completely revitalizes itself thereafter. You could probably guess, based on Star Trek, why I call that the Vulcan moment, first contact, right? So, the idea here being that the Vulcan moment just happened very recently, and so to use human equivalents, these people are back during like Enterprise's era for what humans were at, still getting the hang of all this newfangled technology, still trying to get a perspective on it. And so while they have all this advanced tech, they didn't develop it themselves, so they didn't really know how to implement it themselves, leading to the aforementioned massive inefficiency I mentioned. This is all just stuff that occurred to me to try and explain why this labor shortage existed. Excuse me. I do think it's very important to mention this labor shortage thing because it's the core of the entire episodes. If not for this massive shortage of skilled laborers, and they keep emphasizing that point, by the way, not just people chakong or pushing a button or whatever, but skilled labor shortage, most of the events of this episode wouldn't actually have happened. It is the fundamental bedrock of the two-parter. I love the teaser of this episode. It runs a little long, but it runs exactly as long as it needs to. Again, the amount of information needing to be gotten across is because we see Janeway walking around. And up until that point, and I actually distinctly recall when I first saw this episode on TV, and I'm watching this thinking she's infiltrating, basically, or she's here for some unusual reason. It took me probably about 10 minutes into the episode total to really realize that she was not herself, because the way they phrase and design the whole situation is such that it could be perceived as that up until a few lines towards about, like I said, about the 9 to 10 minute mark. And it's not until the 11-minute mark that we finally have something, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Point being, during the teaser, Janeway's walking around and trying to get used to where she is, and again, feels kind of like an infiltratey situation. We've actually seen this on Voyager before with Resistance, I believe was the name of the episode. With Janeway, no less. Oh, excuse me. Allergies are killing me right now. Spring! I wish it was winter again. And there's this wonderful line she has. This job will be much better than my last job. And that's the last line before the teaser. And it's a brilliant line because it makes sense both ways. The first time you're watching it, you assume she's talking about Voyager. Okay? And again, catches your interest. Why is Janeway here? A good teaser should not only catch your interest, but invoke questions. Why is she here? Why does she despise her previous job on Voyager? What is this place? Why a factory? Etc., etc. The the other thing it does, of course, is it works with regards to the actual canon of what's actually happening. Because she's presuming her previous job was back on Earth, which was a violent, dust-filled, overpopulated, polluted hellhole. I actually find myself wondering if several of the recruits, I think it's the word I'll use there, all have the same type of mentality programmed into them. Oh, I hated where I was now. Oh, I'm nice now. Let's talk about one thing really quick. This is probably the biggest reason why these episodes, work, in my opinion. They're the same characters. I'm phrasing this wrong. They are playing, Janeway and Tom and B'Elanna. They're playing the same people with different circumstances and memories. It's sort of a pseudo what-if situation. What if Catherine Janeway was born here on this world? What if Tom Paris was born, etc., etc.? You get the idea. What if these people, as they are, with all their personalities intact, with their mentalities intact, their emotions intact, who they are, the, if you will, soul of who they are, remains intact. It's just their memories have been edited, and how they react to the circumstance. Voyager's actually done this once before with the episode The Killing Game, which was a nice touch. I mention that, though, because it's very apparent in many ways that that is exactly what's... how am I putting this? That informs how they act and why they act. And I'll be talking about that more in Part 2, actually, especially with regards to Janeway. But speaking of Janeway, it's interesting to me the type of man that she has become enamored with. I'm just going to lay this out here. This is a man who is relatively charming, but also intelligent, very... I don't want to say dominating, that's actually not the word I want to use, but he is the kind of person who knows how to take charge, but without being... without being crude about it. The kind of person who... has interest in her, and shows and demonstrates that interest regularly, however knows when to back off. In other words, someone who is basically willing to step to her beat, but someone who is willing to make his own beat and insist she step to it now and again. Basically kind of a back and forth situation, which is close to what an actual partnership, theoretically, of course, should be. But more to the point, it also kind of puts her on a little bit of a pedestal because he is clearly pursuing her. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. No judgment to Janeway. No judgment to anybody who wants to be pursued. It's a nice feeling, being pursued. But it's interesting to me that that's the kind of person that Janeway would eventually fall for. Because, again, this is Janeway. Just memory's a little altered. Tuvok, speaking of which, does not understand humor in the slightest bit. I like that, actually, quite a lot, because it's clear that Tuvok is still Tuvok, someone who demonstrates lack of experience, even though his memories are telling him it's okay to smile. Just because you are not keeping your emotions in check does not mean you know how to handle them properly. And it probably is at least one of the reasons why Tuvok is one of the first people to be able to break the mind altering. Which brings me to my next point. There are actually two reasons, in my opinion, why Tuvok is the first one to break the mind altering. I already listed the first one. He is immensely emotionally unstable. He has all of the powerful Vulcan emotions going through him, and none of the self-control he would normally exhibit, because that's all up here, right? Thing is, he also has an immensely patterned, disciplined brain, which is insisting on the fractal pattern it has already built for itself, which the current reality does not conform to, hence him being able to put the pieces together relatively quickly. It's funny to me, actually, because it's almost a plot point that they inoculate against radiation. I've talked about this before. The idea of inoculating against radiation is actually kind of ridiculous when you actually think about it. Radiation is not a disease. Radiation is not a virus. And inoculation doesn't actually work that way anyways. However, let's ignore the fact that both halves of inoculate and radiation don't actually work in this case. My first reaction is kind of to facepalm, and then I started thinking about it. I wonder if there actually is no radiation at all. You ever think about that? I mean, it's positive. I don't believe the episode ever actually lays it out fully, because they're always, we're going to treat you for blah 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 syndrome, some made up syndrome that is the people who have been mind altered. But it's entirely possible that as a method of continuing to make sure that people remain programmed, they go these inoculations against radiation that's definitely here and totally not made up. Take your meds. Take your happy pills. You see where I'm going with this? I do say that a lot, don't I? I'm sorry, ever since Pax made fun of me for that, I've been a little more self-conscious. I have my own mannerisms. What do you want from me? I also like, I mentioned earlier, the advantages of a two-parter. One of the other advantages is you can take your time establishing things a little bit more. Especially in a more episodic series like Star Trek, as opposed to Babylon 5, which can take however much time it wants to establish something, because it's a series of string continuity. Here, what they have available is, we have to establish everything within an episode, so we've got like 3 scenes across 2 minutes to establish stuff. Go, go, go. And that's not necessarily bad. It's kind of normal. But it is the kind of thing that you look at and it's like, oh my god. Here they take, as I mentioned earlier, 11 minutes to actually get to the crux of the situation. All of the build-up to that is character development, establishment, really showcasing the situation so that we, the audience, are fully aware these are our characters. The people on Voyager, the crew of Voyager, but they're not right. Their memories are wrong, and they are wrong. And then, as part of the whole radiation inoculation thing, leading into Tuvok's thing, immediately we jump over to Harry and Neelix and Chakotay. And then we find out the reality of what happened. It's actually nice structure with regards to the storytelling. So that brings me, of course, to the ECH, the Emergency Command Hologram. I like the continuity of it. I do like the fact that it shows the usefulness of such a feature. I also really like the demonstration of a typical crisis from the Doctor's view. We only get a few scenes of it, really. But it reminded me, in a good way, of the Lower Decks perspective. Normally, when a crisis happens on the ship, we, the viewers, are on the bridge, or engineering, or both. The two command nexi of a ship. And we know exactly what's happening and why it's happening. It's nice every now and again, just as a break, to do that Lower Decks kind of a thing. Here, it's not quite as Lower Decks as the ensigns on Deck 3 or whatever. But in this case, it's the Doctor, who's just standing around all of a sudden, oh my god, things are going horribly wrong, what the hell? Quick, transfer to the thing, inundated. We don't actually know, from the Doctor's perspective for a little bit, what actually happened. It takes several more scenes of establishment. Again, it's just a little slice. But it was a nice variance. It was nice to see things from the Doctor's perspective, and that also makes sense, since it would have been too easy to basically be lazy writing-wise, and just write, here's exactly what happened, ignoring the fact that the Doctor should know exactly what happened, because he didn't at the time. Here's an interesting question. This is something that's actually been debated before. So we know that for a fact that the EMH is an immensely, massively complicated program. And we know that recreating him is not easy to do. Even fixing him was not easy to do. So, isn't it logical in its own right that the ECH is similar, right? Here's what I'm getting to. There are theories rotating about, and I don't believe we are ever told absolutely, that the ECH and the EMH, even though they have the same, shall we say, personality matrix, have different databases. The idea being that the ECH may know some basic medical training, but not be the incredibly brilliant doctor that we have seen who has invented entirely new treatments based on his experiences. Similarly, the EMH, of course, would not be able to take command in a command situation. Not because of authority, but because of lacking those tactics. Just a theory, but it would help to explain a couple of things, not the least of which being why he seems to insist on being the ECH, and why he wants to stay in command, and of course, why he kind of failed at helping Harry Kim. Technically twice. So let's talk about the scheme of the enemy. We know that the Doctor is in it, and, I don't actually remember the Doctor's name. I know that's normal for me, but I was paying attention this time. I even wrote down Joffin's name. He's the guy Janeway has been shacking up with. Forgive me for putting it so crudely. But the Doctor's name, who's basically the primary antagonist of the whole episode, is never mentioned. And neither's the Minister guy that they talk to. I wonder if the Minister's in on it. I actually don't remember. I know they say several people are in on it when it comes to the next episode. Anyways, it's a nice 1-2 punch when it comes to the scheme. It almost makes me wonder if this labor shortage was engineered. I don't think it was, personally. I think that's a little bit too convoluted for a scheme. But when you already have a labor shortage, you can profit nicely by stealing the crews of ships who, by definition, are probably skilled workers. Edit their brains so that they will think differently. I'm not even going to get into how he somehow has the ability to edit the minds of dozens of different species. Let's not even get into the different mind, neural patterns and all. Let's just presume he has that ability somehow, even to a former drone. Let's just presume it for a moment. And if you have that ability to do that, it gives him a tremendous boost. Basically, he can go ahead and get all those skilled laborers, which gets him, the kickbacks, and of course, the person who actually steals the ship gets shiny new ships. And if I have to explain why a brand new, basically empty starship is helpful, it's actually a really effective way of basically completely mugging your enemy, and that's why it's actually really horrible when you think about it. And that's one of the things I like about these episodes. They're really, really horrifying. This is the kind of horror I like. The kind that doesn't involve gross, obvious, black, guts everywhere, and violence, and just jump scares. No, I like the kind of horror that the more you think about it, the more horrifying it gets. There is a wonderful scene later in this episode where it cuts from... Tuvok's like, oh god, he's being led away. And then a couple of the people are talking, hi, yeah, what's going on? And then it cuts for like 18 or so seconds to Tuvok struggling, screaming as they're descending upon him. And by this point in the episode, we now have context enough to understand that he is about to be violated. Mentally in this case, but still, they are about to violate his mind, reprogram him. And then it cuts immediately to Tom casually serving drinks in the thing. That's the kind of thing that's horrifying to me, the kind of horror I enjoy. Because that is this planet in a nutshell, and we'll see more of this in episode 2. This planet is all about a surface that is brilliantly shiny and sheeny, and everyone's happy, and everything's great. But when you dig under the surface, you see just how absolutely horrible things really are. Because again, if you mug someone, that's a pretty horrible thing to do. If you mug someone and also take their vehicle, that's even more horrible. If you mug someone, take their vehicle, and then reprogram their brain to be willing laborers, you are literally stealing their life. Think about that for a moment. Doctor Who even invented an entire species based on this concept. The weeping angels. The statues, they do kill you. It's just the fact that they kill you by sending you into the past. But they still kill you. Your life has ended, even if you are still breathing. Think about it. It is really horrible, horrifying when we actually analyze it for a moment. Also, I want to give props to the action sequence that happens between the ECH and the enemy ship. I know that sounds weird, but after years and years of me constantly commenting on how Voyager does not know how to do combat, it was nice to see a combat sequence that was actually pretty much spot on. There's Voyager, there's the enemy ship. Lock onto tractor, fire. Lock onto these two things, fire. Get us out of here. Get us out of here at warp drive as quickly as possible. The presentation that is given is that Voyager is a match for one of these ships. Holy hell, which by itself is surprising. But then, on top of that, the reason Voyager is still outmatched is because there's several of these ships. Voyager against several ships and having that be a problem, I'm with that. Voyager fighting against a single Kazon ship and losing to it just is mind-boggling, but again, you get the point. It was nice to see them do it right for once. I also like, there's a line Janeway gives I want to bring to your attention. She doesn't, I forget the exact wording and I forgot to write it down, but she draws attention to the fact that she and Tuvok are different species. Therefore, obviously, they wouldn't know each other. Now, that's an interesting thing to say, isn't it? There's a lot that could be analyzed just from that one perspective. The question I posit to you is, do you think that was programmed in? Or do you think that's just a natural byproduct of the way most species think? After all, how many species are in the Romulan Star Empire? I'll go ahead and spoil it for you. There are 2. How many are in the Klingon Empire? Not counting STO, of course. 1. How many are in the Federation? Hundreds upon hundreds. If you actually think about it, in Star Trek, the Federation is the outlier. There are precious few major organizations, or hell, even planetary-bound or system-bound organizations that involve multiple species. So it's actually kind of the norm to not be associating with someone outside of your species. Which is also funny because they call attention to that in this episode several times. How unusual it is that this power plant and this planet actually has multiple species here. So even if you don't accept that as the norm back home, it may very well be the norm out here in the Delta Quadrant. Which, I mean, demonstrably it kind of is. Unless you're Borg, of course. They don't discriminate. We take all comers. So the scenes between Tom and B'Elanna are fantastic. I don't have much to talk about on them, except for 2 points. First of all, 3 points, excuse me. First of all, I like that Tom is not put off by the fact that she's pregnant. He's put off by the fact that he assumes she's married. And they make that clear, too. It's clear by their dialogue that he is saying, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize you were taken." He doesn't say that, of course. And then she says, "No, not married." And then he's like, "Oh." And then she leaves. And then he continues to be there for her. Some people have posited the idea that this is part of the whole soul thing I mentioned earlier, assuming you were to presume souls exist within Star Trek, which is a debatable topic, of course. The idea that Tom's soul is still connected to her soul and the soul of his daughter, and therefore he is naturally leaning towards this inclination. Whether or not you posit that reality or not, though, again, it still fits because these are the same people, just different memories. So even though he does not know this person, what he sees is a person who is vulnerable, a little bit introverted, a little bit standoffish, and in absolutely, apparently obvious need of a friend. So while I have no doubt that there was some amorous and romantic intention from Tom's initial pursuit of her, it becomes clear by the second scene, which is the second thing I want to point out, that he actually cares about this person as a friend, because that's Tom Paris. And it is. Chaotic good. I want to be here for you. Tom has been the one to reach out to so many characters across Voyager. It would be no surprise to me that if B'Elanna was an alien who just happened to be in those circumstances, standoffish, pregnant, scared, and traumatized, it's been hard dealing with this situation, and in need of a friend, that Tom would reach out to her. No question of that in my mind. And I like how that catches her off guard. And I like his suggestion, the idea of, I was going to introduce you to another family. This is something that's actually really helpful in real life, assuming you do it right. An expecting mother being introduced to other people who also either are having or have just had a child, so that the parents can share relation experience between themselves to try and figure out how to be a parent, but also so that the children have someone their age to interact with, even at a young age. Which is very, very important. Actually, I would say the most absolutely critical aspect of human development, especially when you're that young. You need to interact with others, and it helps to interact with others of your own age. So, all of that just speaks to me of Tom's overall mentality towards family, which I know I've hammered that point a lot, but it's kind of the theme of Season 7 overall. If I had to use one word to define Season 7, it would be family. I also like the fact that they have amazing chemistry despite effectively playing different characters. You notice that? I just point that out Because, as I've said before, chemistry is not a character thing. It is an actor thing. Actors have chemistry together, not characters. Characters may have chemistry in a fictional work where there's no voice acting and no actors. Just that kind of thing. That's a possibility. That comes down to the writer at that point. Although I would actually argue that that's not chemistry at that point, which just brings me back to my point. Chemistry is all about actors and the way they interact with each other. Whether it's voice actors or physical actors doesn't matter. There's obviously some difference between the two. But my point is, it's still the people, the real people, that have that chemistry one with another. And despite the fact that he's playing some guy who's stuck on his luck trying to get a job, and she's playing someone who doesn't even know who the father of her child is, they still have a significant amount of chemistry together on screen. I have one comment here. Originally this was actually going to be a nitpick. Harry mentions it will take them 3 days at maximum warp to get to this planet from the nebula they're hiding in. Why so long? 3 days at warp 9 is a huge distance. I know I did the warp scale thing and it's debatable, but either way, that is a long freaking distance. 3 days at warp 9 is huge, right? Here's my question for you. Is that an obvious just error of them not understanding warp travel, which is the obvious answer, or is that a sign of how bad things have gotten? Let me put it to you this way. As much as it probably is just an example of people not knowing their warp speeds and whatnot, I think it's more likely, I think it makes more sense, even if it's less likely, that in this case what that means is that these people have started casting the net farther and farther away from their home system. That they have been doing this particular two-punch horrifying thing of mugging people and stealing their lives for so long at this point, and they've gotten so practiced at it, that they have run out of prey, and they need to cast the net wider and wider and wider. So it gets to the point where they are attacking people from light years upon light years away from their home system in order to get this. Think about it for a moment. It kind of adds to that whole horror thing I mentioned earlier. I like how they're using Neelix's ship again. Continuity is good. I like how... I like the interdynamic between the ECH and Kim. Between the Doctor and Kim. I'm trying to say ECH to make it more clear what I'm referring to, though. I don't think of him as a separate person. But I mention that because it's an interesting dynamic. It just feels like this is really not the time for it. I like Chakotay's response to it. Figure it out. We're going. I also like that because it'll actually become rather apparent in the next episode, but get to that later. So, I do very much wonder how the hell Seven was as susceptible to this as everyone else. But I do like how, if you think about it, Seven was very well placed from a writing perspective. As a writer, you want the pieces to fall in a certain way, so events happen in a certain order. So, for example, if you're writing this episode from the beginning, you'd sit here and think, okay, Tuvok needs to be the first person to release, to get free of this. That makes sense. He's Tuvok. Okay, who's the second person? And of all the choices, Seven is actually the logical second choice. She is also very logical, also has a very disciplined mind, is also very capable, and would be able to be well positioned to do a lot about that. So, how do we get Tuvok and Seven to interact? We need Seven to have a presence, but since we don't have a lot of character stuff because we're focusing so much more on Tom and Janeway and the issues on the ship, we need to have Seven be in a position so where she will be regularly interacting with everyone. Hence the creation of the idea of an efficiency monitor. Speaking personally, by the way, I've worked in corporate America before. I think I've mentioned that. I've done so more than once, more than twice. You get the idea. I've done it many times. Most of my career has actually been in corporate America in one manner or another. Efficiency consultants can suck it. I'm just saying. Like, there's a real purpose behind being efficient with regards to how you run your business, but every efficiency consultant I've ever encountered in my life has been someone who, at best, is a snake oil salesman, and at worst, is actually making things worse by consequence of their policies and the things they implement. I'm reminded of an old Foxtrot comic where an efficiency consultant is brought on and saying, here's the result of my things. By my results, you will save X amount of money over the next 5 years. And the guy's like, oh wow, that's great. Minus my fee, of course. I mentioned that because it makes me wonder if they legitimately had no, like in character, if they had nowhere else to put Seven, or if that was, again, a role that was purely invented for the sake of getting her into interaction with Tuvok. I just thought I'd bring it up. No offense to any of my viewers who are efficiency consultants. If you are, just do your job correctly. That's all I ask. That's all I ask. I do like Chakotay's interactions with Janeway. I keep wanting to call her Catherine because kind of to showcase the difference here, because he figures out pretty much just like that she's not her. He walks over and says, "Hey, it's Chakotay," and she says, "Who?" And he immediately switches gears. His first approach is, "This is the captain." His second approach is, "This is the captain, except she's being mind programmed." And that's when they first bring up the concept of programming. It's never actually answered in either episode. But there's an undercurrent possibility here. I mentioned the horror thing, right? How many of these people are programmed to some extent or another? They are in a desperate labor shortage, I remind you. Whatever the cause, they're willing to do pretty horrible things to make this labor shortage go away. We know at least some of the government is involved. I forget the exact individuals. They mentioned that in part 2. We know at least some of the government is involved. I wouldn't be surprised if a large amount of the government is turning a blind eye because we're in a crisis, and however we get the laborers, fine. What I want to know is how many of these people, even people who came here looking for a job, have been altered, have been programmed to be happy. Take your inoculation. The climax of this episode... Oh, I'm sorry, real quick thing. I like how Neelix demonstrates very similar instincts with Tom. Neelix is actually pretty good in this episode. I like the climax, even though it's weird, if you think about it. Because the climax is... all of the major plot threads thus far are all reaching a climactic point. They've gotten Torres on the ship, so they've freed one of their crew members finally, and it happens to be Torres. So we get her up there, quick! Oh God, we've got to help her, and she's like, "No, get away from me," because she doesn't know these people. And then we've got Chakotay, who is desperately trying to get away from the people who are trying to hurt or kill him. Then we've got Tuvok, who is being reprogrammed as we speak, and then we've got Janeway and Joffin, who are basically going steady. And I love the contrast there between the oh god, we should move in together. I'm not actually making fun though, because it is actually a significant point of character development, and I have argued for years that character development and character points should not take a backseat to the danger of the week. So I'm with that, and it'll be very, very relevant when we get to part 2, which I will see you guys for next week.